book is actually written, is also aligned with high school educational standards for biology, for Common Core, and for agricultural education. So, so if anyone's working in the schools or interested in bringing some of this into the schools, you don't need a degree in agronomy or environmental studies, because I don't have one and I wrote the curriculum. So, it's teachers love it when someone else comes in to teach. It's much harder for me to get teachers themselves to do it than it is to find volunteers who can come in and lead people through this. So most teachers that I know around the country are extremely stressed, and having programs that come in gives them a chance to breathe, basically, and learn something new themselves. So I highly recommend getting involved one way or the other with that, and that was my intention for writing that. Trying, kind of going back and forth between different ways we could start here. I think I might jump right in with a demo that some of you will have seen.
It's the bread on the flower.
Brenda was saying, "Why don't you move those things off the table?" And I'm like, "No, that's the whole show here." How many people have seen the bread and the flower? Okay. How many people feel like they could lead someone else? I figure I'm just gonna keep doing it till everyone in the room says, "Oh, I know how to do that. I've been doing that for years." So. And this little demo has become kind of well known, and there are other people starting to use it, which is fun for me. And I like to put the flour on the red plate for those of you who are learning how to do it. That's sort of like the emergency plate. So I want to just show you a little bit about what's the difference between living soil and dirt. And when I say dirt, that's become kind of a shortcut in the soil health world for soil that doesn't have any biology working in it, or very minimal biology. And what I've been working on for the last few years is about land function, which is very different than thinking about what species live somewhere. It's about how is the landscape as a whole working, and we'll get into more of that. But I want to. This is an easy way to show how a landscape might function. So we're going to pretend that this is a field or a large park or something like that. And this one, we have just separate particles of broken down rocks. So it's just the sand, silt, and clay, which is what, when most people talk about soil, that's what they say, oh, soil is made up of sand, silt, and clay. So what we want to figure out is what happens when you rain on soil that is unaggregated. It means that the particles are separate from each other. So who would like to make a rain cloud? Someone who doesn't have celiac. Okay.
Doesn't have
Celiac, because the one unfortunate thing is that this is involved with bread and flour, so a bunch of holes in the bottom, yeah. And I want you to imagine being in Kansas with 150 ranchers who are all making rain clouds at the same time, and what a great noise that is.
That'd be great.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Who would like to be God?
We are.
We're the goddess. Somebody.
Someone.
Mom?
Oh, there you go.
We need a little water. So we need the force that's beyond God.
Bubbling water, okay? You want plain
Just
water?
any old water. I don't know about seltzer water. That's interesting. I've got some water over here.
Okay.
Okay, I'll be the water cycle.
Okay.
Filling this. Okay. So you're gonna be the rain cloud.
Oh, shall I pour it in?
And you're gonna pour that in there, and then I want everybody to watch. You can come get up if you like. Come see. And we're gonna see what happens when we rain on unaggregated soil. Okay. Now, anyone who's made bread has a kind of an idea here. What's going on?
This is separating.
It's separating, yep.
It runs right off.
It runs right off. If this was a landscape,
It's not absorbing it.
it's not absorbing it, really
Washing
key.
away.
Yep. Yep, so, and the particles of the soil, are they staying?
Dry.
They're staying dry, but some of them are also
Run off.
going out, running off, and so we actually have erosion that's going into the waterway there, right? Now, if you were to put this plate, thank you, shall we sit? You can sit down or you can stay, because there's one more thing we're doing here. So if we were to put this out into the sun, in the hot sun, what would happen to that water? It would evaporate pretty quickly because it stayed on the surface, right? It didn't soak in. And if before we had done, I can't do this in the library, but when I teach outside I can. Before we rained on it, if a big wind had come along, would the soil stay in place? No, it would blow away, right? So that we have wind erosion and water erosion. Did you know that during the Dust Bowl, right when they were trying to make the speech to talk about why we needed a soil conservation service in Washington, D.C., dust from Oklahoma blew into Washington, D.C. and darkened the windows just while they were making the speech? Yes.
And so when the rain falls on that soil too, and then the sun comes out, is it also then kind of creating a almost clay-like layer on the top of it?
Exactly, right. So yes, if you were to put that in, it would not only would it evaporate, but you'd have this kind of gummy thing that then
bakes it
eventually would turn into something hard and cracked, right? So we see that in Mexico, we see that in Africa, and we're starting to see that in the United States, actually. The United States is one of the areas on the globe that is desertifying faster than anywhere else. So, yeah, we think of it as, oh, that happens to other people, but we're right in the thick of it. Okay, so what do you add besides moisture to flour to turn it into bread? You add yeast, which is a microorganism. And so bread is basically flour that has had biological work happening in it. And it's not the same thing, it's not the same kind of work that's happening in soils, but if this was unhealthy soil and healthy soil, or unaggregated soil and aggregated soil, it would be the same, the function would shift in a similar way because the structure has shifted in a similar way, okay? So what's different about this and this in terms of the structure?
The bread has a matrix.
Right, it's a matrix, and there's a few different things that are really key there. One is that the particles themselves have been glued together by the slimes and glues of life, okay? In soil, they would also be tied together by the little root hairs and the fungal hyphae. And then in soil, here the pores are made actually from CO2 moving up through the bread, right? But in soil, most of those pores are made partly from the aggregates moving towards each other and sticking together, so it leaves space, but also all the different life, from microscopic all the way up to groundhogs and wolves and things digging holes into the soil. So we have pores of all different sizes. So let's see what happens when we rain on healthy soil. When we rain onto healthy soil.
Oh.
Okay. And here I'm putting 3 times as much water in this cup.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so,
Can I stop?
well, let's see what's happening. So what's different in terms of the way that it's functioning? We talked about the difference in the
It's
structure.
absorbing.
It's absorbing it, yeah. And what else
right?
is it doing?
Not a lot of runoff.
So that was 3 times as much. Let's try 6 times as much.
Soaked. I mean, it's moist.
And it's maintaining its integrity and
It's
shape.
maintaining its integrity. Yeah, part of what's really interesting in the soil sponge, which seems to be also true in bread, is that the where the water is moving down, the aggregates actually have a hydrophobic coating on them, if you think of like drying egg whites, right? A lot of this is made out of the slimes of life, and when they dry, they are hydrophobic. If you think about old icon paintings that have lasted for millennia because the water won't damage them once you've made them out of egg.
Egg and
Right.
flora, yeah.
So you have this hydrophobic thing that is also very absorbent. So that is the definition of a sponge, right? So a kitchen sponge is the same thing. Bread operates in a similar way. So first of all, it's taken at least 6 times as much water. We still don't even have any water coming out the sides. But if we kept pouring and pouring, when we did get the water coming through, would it have particles in it, or would it be clean and clear? It would probably be clean and clear. And if, for example, we were using chemicals in this landscape, then the sponge would absorb some of them due to physics, and it would also be breaking some of them down due to biology in the soil. So for example, a friend of mine has an organization that is advocating for using human urine for nitrogen as a fertilizer, which of course is what nature does, right? With all different urine. And I said to her, well, but what about all of the pharmaceuticals that are in people's urine? And we now know that's really a problem in city water supplies, is that the pharmaceuticals don't get broken down completely. And she said actually that they've been doing research on this and that the soil will break that down.
Wow.
So that's pretty cool, because that's one of the few ways we know to get. And what it means by breaking it down, it means it's taking those carbon chains that some scientists put together to make that particular drug and breaking it back down into the carbon and hydrogen and whatever else was in there. So.
Now, how important is it that, have you tried this with, say, Melba toast or completely dried bread that's been left? How important is it that it started with some moisture in it already? Obviously, healthy soil is going to have some moisture in it,
Right.
but does it, I imagine it also is able, if it's healthy, to maintain its integrity even when it's dried out?
Yes, but I mean, you're bringing up a good point that when we do water infiltration testing, the water infiltration test performs a little bit differently depending on how much rain you've had, and there is a sort of a priming the pump that happens when we get that first rainfall, and so similarly, where this kind of gets worse and worse each time it rains, this will get better and better each time it rains.
That's what happened in California.
So yeah. And in California, when this was a couple years ago, when they heard that the drought was, they were going to have a break in the drought and the rain was coming, the word went out for everybody to go and plow up their grass and plow their fields so that it was open to accept the rain. That is exactly the wrong thing to do. Because when you plow this, if you were to put that into a blender, it would not have that structural integrity anymore.
That's really great.
So, and also the grass that's growing, like if you were to plow up your lawn when it was raining, the grass that's growing acts like a million tiny dams to keep the water from moving sideways, and it also breaks the incredible force of rain falling on the soil. So raindrops are actually shaped like little. There's a kind of a bullet that's shaped like this at the bottom. So it hits here first. And then the secondary thing is actually even more powerful. So when rain is falling, it's shaped like that, like a little upside down tooth. And so you get this really incredible double impact. And that's a lot of compaction that you see. If you go to a farm that does a lot of tillage and you go after rain, you'll see that the surface has been sealed off. And part of what happens is the little silt particles, the smallest particles, will move really easily with the water, and they will go in and fill in all of these spaces, so you don't have any openings on the surface. And then you bake that in the sun for a few days, and then the next time it rains, it runs off even more and more and more, and that's how a drought starts. So you can see here, if we think about that this part ends up being kind of drought, you can see why flooding and drought actually go together. Seems sort of counterintuitive, but it's because the water moves, hits the land, won't soak in, and then moves sideways. And a lot of New England is starting to have that problem. that Vermont is in the middle of a drought and we have an enormous flood. So it seems like, well, it should soak it up. But what Laska was saying, that it's partly when it's gotten too dried out, especially if the structural integrity has been compromised, then you're going to have that flooding. So if you lived somewhere that got a lot of rain, which one of these would you rather have around your house? The bread. And if you live somewhere that only got a little bit of rain and you were trying to garden or grow food, which one would you rather have?
Bread.
Also the bread.
Yeah.
If you live somewhere with high winds,
Also the bread.
Oh, the bread's gonna win every time.
the only thing I've been able to think of, we could go on with that for a long time, but, a lot of chemicals being used, right? You'd still rather have the bread. The only thing I can think of is, where you want something a little bit more like the flower is a coastal, like a beach ecosystem, right? So there are some animals that really like to lay their eggs in sand, etc. But sand is interesting because sand is actually very porous because it doesn't have the silt and clay particles that will fill in. It doesn't have those particles that will clump up. So, and even on a coastal ecosystem, what do all the signs say on Cape Cod? They say don't pick the grass, right? Stay off the dunes,
Stay off,
right?
yeah.
Because those plants are what's making this. They're making it indirectly though. So the plants are taking carbon, CO2 out of the atmosphere, combining it with water that comes up through their roots, using solar power, and they're creating carbohydrates. They're sticking together carbon, the hydrogen, the oxygen, right? They're letting off some of the oxygen back for all of us to breathe. And then they're making themselves out of that. So they're making carbohydrate foods. They also put it together with other things and make proteins like beans and nuts and things like that. And they can make oils and fats, right? So they can make anything that's a plant food. They can make bark. But somewhere between 40 to 60% of the sugars that a plant makes through photosynthesis, they feed down through their roots to underground life. In particular, the thing they most love to feed are something called mycorrhizal fungi. And those are fungal organisms that feed directly, like nursing, right on the root of the plant. So it's like a mother-daughter relationship, and they extend out into the soil. They in a square meter of healthy soil, you could have 25,000 kilometers of mycorrhizal fungi, so of those fungal hyphae. And why are those so important for the plant? Well, because first of all, they extend the plant's root system for water. But more importantly is that they are very intelligent and will go and seek out the nutrients that the plant needs. So the bacteria are living often near the roots and eating some things, but some of them are off around, the minerals are everywhere, right? So the minerals are in these, in the sand, silt, and clay. So the bacteria are breaking down those minerals into an available form, but the plant can't get them unless they're right next to them. So the mycorrhizal fungi will go out and say, oh, you need a little bit of copper? Hey, I heard that so-and-so over here has some copper, because they also form communication networks between plants, and they'll go get it. They are shaped like a tube. So here's the plant root, okay? Root hairs, and this is part. It's right into here, but this it's round, okay? And this whole thing is a membrane, and a membrane is the most basic form of intelligence. It's what makes life. Is something that has a membrane, a cell that can say, I want this, and I don't want that, right? So I want this much sodium, but not that much sodium. I want this much water, but not too much water. I want calcium, I don't want calcium. And a membrane knows not just what it wants, but how much of each thing it wants in order to sustain the life that's inside it. So when a plant has this relationship, it is expanding the plant's intelligence. A plant that doesn't have mycorrhizal fungi attached to it, it has the roots going down, but the way that water travels into the roots and the way that nutrients go with the water is just physics. It's not biology. So as the evapotranspiration happens at the top of the plant, it sucks water up from the bottom. So if you have a soil system that is just like this, you're getting whatever is in the soil, naturally or unnaturally. You're getting just the whatever water is in there, whatever chemicals are in there, whatever minerals are in there, in whatever quantities they're there in the soil. When you have a plant system that's in a healthy system that has been created this way, then you're getting the right nutrients, and it's keeping out the toxins too. So, and there's kind of a double whammy, because if you don't have the right ratio of nutrients coming in, that ratio of nutrients is what creates the parts of your own membranes in your own body that can break down any toxins that do come in. So this way you're getting the nutrients that protect you from the toxins, and you're not getting the toxins. Here you're getting the toxins, and you're not getting the nutrients that you need to protect you from the toxins. So all of that is a really big vote for a no-till system, right? A system where you don't break all those hyphae apart every time that you're about to start gardening. And there are lots of really cool ways to do no-till, and lots of people are getting even more creative with it, where you're really building on top. So even people are doing things like no-till potatoes by using certain materials like seaweed and hay and other things like that you're basically building on top, and then the roots can go down and find the soil. And then you just kind of uncover the potatoes later. So now, if you think about how much impervious surfaces that we have in Cambridge, we have a lot. We also have a lot of trees, which is awesome. But we have all the pavement, right? Except for those wonderful Somerville depavers who depaved some driveways and things.
That's right. Yeah.
We have all the rooftops, and we have parks that are very compacted in general. So most of these parks, if you did a water infiltration test, the water is not going to soak in faster than it would run sideways. So when we see flooding in Massachusetts, it's not just the storm surge, it's also that the rain doesn't have anywhere to go. So every little place that you can create a sponge is a place that's going to soak up some of that rain. It's also much better for your storm system. The city is going to have to spend less money processing all the water that goes down the sewer drains, et cetera. And some cities have managed to separate out the rain from the rest, and some haven't. I don't know where Cambridge is out of that. But there's one city that started a tax, and this is perhaps a project from others out front, I don't know, a tax on impervious surfaces, which is very easy to see on Google Earth. And you could figure out who's got how much, and anytime anybody takes their lawn and paves it, they're actually going to pay more. And anytime someone depaves it, they're going to pay less. So
Who has that?
I can find out for you if you email me, but I don't remember where it is. I think it might be somewhere in Ohio. But we think that's a really cool.
But that's a really good intro to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
How are bricks?
What's that?
Bricks are more penetrable.
Yeah, so there's some cool things. There are some permeable pavements that are starting to happen.
Yep.
Now, I'm all for that, and there's also some really interesting things where the storm drains go down and they're actually watering the plants from underneath, right? So like the tree is there and the water's going there rather than the water running away from the trees that are planted in the sidewalk. So there's some great stuff like that, and there are rain gardens, which are right under the rain spout, that it's a very absorbent kind of plants and soils there that people can make. Because there's also, it's not just like, is it paved or not? Because a soil surface can be more or less permeable. So, okay. Let me go through a few slides and give you a little bit more background on kind of where I'm coming from, and then we can do another exercise. So some of this we've just talked through, but let's see, is there a clicker? There's a clicker. Does it work?
Does it work?
Does anyone ever use one of these? Does it get turned on?
Do you need to use your own computer?
She has her own
I can do it on my
computer.
computer. I'm just sort of standing
Yeah.
way over here.
Do you want me to,
I'll just move this.
Yeah, we can have a clicker person clicking.
Yeah, I think I'll drive. Just,
Yeah.
Then I'm having to say. Okay.
Lights on, lights off.
I think you can.
Yeah, we
Can you
can
see
see
it
it.
already? Okay, we're gonna come back to this.
Not good.
Could you turn it off a little
Would
bit?
be better with the light on.
With the light off.
Light
Some
off?
of
Okay.
them.
Oh, much better.
Much.
Oh, we have a researcher in our midst. Could be, yes. Yeah. Okay. No, I mean that at least is one place that's
It's
just.
looking like it's 9 counties in Maryland that have an impermeable surface.
Yeah, Maryland's doing some very interesting things, so. Okay, this
have
is
a
my dog
pollinator.
Phoebe leading us on a little
I just
walk
want to mention
down.
that Maryland has a pollinator protection act that we're trying to get them here. Yeah, they've had one for 2 years, so.
Oh, that's a pointer. Okay. So we're just going to go for a little walk down to my river, which is the Untitled River, which is really what got me interested in all of this. I had been working for 20-something years on the book that's now The Ecology of Care. It had been, the working title for many years was Sustainable Medicine, and I was thinking more about peak oil and people running out of oil, and how was our healthcare system going to adapt to that if that happened, because I visited Cuba, where they did have a sudden political lack of oil when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they adapted their healthcare system and their agricultural system really nicely to that. And so I was thinking about that, and then, well, let's keep going on the river here. So, just to give you a little context of where I've been doing my thinking. So this is on Pompanousek River. This is in the spring. It gets kind of wild. But one summer in 2011, it got even wilder. And this was during Hurricane Irene, which I know you all experienced as well. And we lost, in Vermont, we lost 500 miles of roads, and I think 300 bridges.
oh my God.
And I want you to notice here that where there are trees and grass, the things stayed intact, and where there was an impermeable or a soil surface, things did not stay intact. Same thing here. It's a dirt road of a friend of mine. And after Irene, a couple of things happened. One is I suddenly got really interested in climate change because I suddenly understood that it was about water. And I'm a water person. I think we're all water people.
80%.
Yes, or 80%. The second thing is that whenever I drove anywhere after Irene, I couldn't help but think what's going to happen the next time we get a really big rain here. And I was fascinated. I kept going down these roads and taking pictures, and just really interested in this dynamic because, as a child, like many of you, I had played a lot in streams and, pouring water outside and playing with hoses and it's interesting, right? What water does when you pour it on something. And I think that the reason a lot of us find that fascinating as a child is that it actually is part of our survival, right? To understand how a landscape works or how things work when water or wind hits it is part of what we need to know in terms of knowing where is a safe place to be. So in 2014, while I was still writing this book, it took 9 years to write this book, and I was researching climate change. This is sort of the wrong slide for this story, but that's okay. I read Judy Schwartz's book, Cows Save the Planet, and Other Improbable Ways of Restoring Soil to Heal the Earth. And about halfway through that book, I said, this is what I want to do when I grow up. And I changed my career from acupuncture to working in soils pretty much overnight as soon as I could figure out a way to get some grants, which luckily I had one kind of angel investor who was a former patient of mine, gave me a grant right off the bat, and then I used that to write some more. And my goal right off the bat was to create curriculum, create learning resources so that I could keep track of my learning process and pass it along to other people. Because I've found that's the best way for me to learn is to turn around and teach other people. So I started playing around with how do I explain what I'm learning, and came up with things like the bread and the flour. So this is the one that's now available online for free at that web address, and there are other resources there as well. So this year, on July 1st, I was up in the Adirondacks with Bosca and my mom, and I was writing the chapter in Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function that's called A Walk in the Rain. And the activity is to go out for a walk in the rain and see what's happening at the edge of parking lots, what's happening in your lawn, what's happening on your sandy driveway, where's the water running off, where's it soaking in, where is it puddling and pooling, is there a little floody area and some dip in your lawn where it's a little bit compacted or something like that. And as I was writing that chapter, I got a call from their dad saying, I just want to let you know that we're having some pretty serious flooding here in town, because I was in the Adirondacks and they were all in Vermont. So that's the same road.
Oh, my God. Unbelievable.
So that's the road right behind my house that I walk on every day. And it's going to be at least 2 years before that gets fixed. It's been half a year already. And 70% of the roads in our town were damaged by that flood. And we only have 2,500 people in our town, and not all of them are tax-paying adults. And with $5 million worth of damage just from one storm, that we have to pay ourselves before FEMA or any other funds will kick back to us. So our town meeting was spent talking about what kind of loan can we get, how are we going to pay it, are we willing to pay the interest on a loan as a town? So anyway, this is going to be a big issue. This is just the beginning. This is Lake Champlain, a little bit north of me, and you can see there's a lot of beautiful farmland around Lake Champlain. But if you get up close to the lake, this is what you see. And this is an algae bloom. So an algae bloom is when there's a lot of agricultural runoff into the lake. And now I'm going to move these for an algae bloom is where there's a lot of agricultural runoff, and it fuels provides food for algae, and these algae are toxic, and they can create acute illnesses if you swim or drink or let your dog play in it. But my son's girlfriend's dad is a neurologist who's been doing a lot of work on algae blooms and chronic neurological disorders. So ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, and Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease are now all, they're starting to look at these may actually have been partly created by, there are various mechanisms, but one big one may be exposure to airborne algae. So, taking the ferry across Lake Champlain every summer, or living near a dam or waterfall where the water goes over and churns up. So inhaling them is problematic. So when we have a functioning soil sponge like the bread, that is one of the main ways of preventing algae blooms, because that means when it rains, all of those chemicals and the manure, et cetera, are not running into the lakes and rivers. They're staying in the soil. And when I fly across the country and I look down, huge, vast parts of the country are bright blue and bright green when you look down at the lakes. They are not healthy. And lots of communities are dealing with this, because there are a lot of communities that have lots of little ponds right in their communities, in these agricultural communities. Okay, so we're back to where we sort of started, to thinking of healthy topsoil as this living matrix. It's made out of life, the living, the dead, and the very dead. And it's a carbon-rich sponge. It's carbon-rich because the plants are taking that CO2 and feeding that carbon down and creating the life underground. So the carbon is in the microorganisms. It's in the earthworms. It's in the plant roots. It's in the fungal hyphae. It's also in the products, those slimes and glues that they exude. And it also becomes a much more of a permanent carbon storage when certain things happen. So when we create the humates, or when we create glomalin, which is when the fungal hyphae die off, they create this sticky substance called glomalin. And that's how we start to accumulate soil carbon. We accumulate it in living things, we accumulate it in dead things, and we accumulate it in very dead things like peat moss and fossil fuels. So those are all parts of the carbon cycle underground. I don't think I have slides for this, but I joined right off the bat in 2014. I joined up with the Soil Carbon Coalition, which is a nonprofit that has, the founder, Peter Donovan, has been traveling the North American continent in a school bus and doing soil tests at all of the most innovative regenerative farms and ranches around North America, Canada, Mexico, etc. And I joined him on one trip in 2014 when we were going back to re-monitor after putting in a baseline. He put in a baseline in 2011. We went back in 2014. And this whole group of ranchers had soil carbon gains that were unlike anything we were seeing anywhere else. And this was in Saskatchewan, Canada, so former prairie, but that had been terribly degraded soils, and that they had taken them out of wheat and canola and flax production and put them back into a prairie system. So they started growing beef and turkeys and lamb and other things like that, as well as vegetables for their family and their communities. And all of them had substantial gains in soil carbon. The one that was the highest, a square mile of their land would be gaining every year the equivalent amount of carbon as 800 Canadian citizens' emissions every year. Yeah, shall I say that again?
Yeah.
So a square mile of their land, if you extrapolate it out, I don't know that they had an entire square mile themselves, but between all of these farmers, they would have. If all of the land were drawing down carbon the way that the experimental plot where we measured was, a square mile would be drawing down or would be storing and gaining the equivalent carbon as the CO2 emissions of 800 Canadians. And I say Canadians because different countries have different CO2 emissions. And that's every year. So over 3 years, they had gained 3 times that much. So this is why we're not trying to do models of how much carbon could be drawn down. We want to know how much is this farm doing in this place. We want to have a starting point and an ending point. And people, a lot of people talk about carbon farming, and they say, well, I have an organic garden, therefore I'm carbon farming. Well, if you were to take an empty lot that was paved over and you depave it and plant conventional Roundup Ready corn in there, you would be carbon farming, okay? Because you would be putting more carbon into the ground every year than there was under the pavement. If you were to take a beautiful meadow and turn it into a nice organic farm, you would be losing soil carbon. So it's all relative. There is no such thing as carbon farming as a practice, as a best management practice. It's all about how what's happening, how much are you measuring, are you actually gaining it or not? And a lot of people who are doing pretty good land management, following a lot of the basic ideas, we found are not gaining soil carbon. So that's kind of disappointing, but and we're still called the Soil Carbon Coalition, which I kind of wish we were called the Soil Carbon and Water Coalition. So I say, but because if you can get the structure and function of your land doing this, we can address everything we're worried about climate change, as well as pretty much every other major issue facing society these days all over the world. So if I don't explain that adequately, ask me about it in a little while. So I'll keep going and we'll see see if you get where I'm going with that. The other issue with thinking about soil carbon as a fix for atmospheric carbon or any drawdown scenario is that the oceans have been holding excess carbon, as I'm sure Tom Garreau talks about. So what the more CO2 there is in the atmosphere, the ocean will absorb some of that. And that's exactly what happens literally. It's not like the bread and flour. This is literally the same thing that happens when you make soda. So if you take some water and you put it in a pressurized chamber, which basically we have here, and you put CO2 above it, the water will absorb some of that CO2 and you'll have fizzy water. And that's our ocean acidification, okay? Is what that carbon does when it's in the water. If you let the cap off and you let the CO2 go somewhere else, right? The ocean or the soda bottle will let it out. So when we draw down carbon in however we're doing it, the ocean is like a soda bottle with the cap taken off, and some of that carbon's coming back up out into the atmosphere. So there's never going to be a direct, instant drawdown from us doing soil carbon work. Okay, really important to understand.
I don't really
Can you
understand that.
repeat that?
But that
Yeah.
helps the ocean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the atmosphere has 400 parts per million right now, and the ocean, I don't know what part per million it has in it, the equivalent of that. Do people want the light back on? I don't know.
Are you gonna show more slides?
Eventually I'll show more slides, but
Let's turn them on
we
now.
can turn them on for now. We're gonna stop it. So, maybe this is a good spot for a picture. And again, this one isn't in that manual, but this is an exercise that one of the high school teachers I worked with came up with, is that we actually took a board like this and put it down, and we took a bunch of pennies or beads or something like that, and we would draw this picture. So this is the ocean, okay, and this is land. And here's a factory pulling oil out of the ground. And here's all the CO2 up here, okay? So for every million particles, we have 400 parts of CO2 right now. And that CO2 came from a lot of different places. So every time we breathe out, we're breathing out CO2. Every time anything breathes out, even plants respire. They do photosynthesis, but they also respire. Things in the ocean are breathing out. So anything in life is respiring. In dry landscapes, the plants are drying up and oxidizing. So just directly, the sunlight breaks the carbon down. And when we burn, there's a really cool video about this. When we burn firewood or we have a forest fire, the carbohydrates, right, that make up the wood are actually turning back into CO2, like spontaneously, basically. So it's backwards photosynthesis happening, and it creates a lot of energy because all that sunlight energy that went into making that comes back out as fire. So fire is sunlight coming back out of wood. Isn't that cool? Climate change is actually a beautiful. I mean the whole climate discussion. We think of it in these very like problem terms, but there's so much beauty in understanding the system, and that's I think a really important piece of being a climate thinker or activist is being able to think about the whole system and where are the places where we can intervene intelligently. So, okay, so we have all these parts per million here, and we also have all this CO2 that the ocean's been holding. If we increase, we put more here, okay, so let's say we burn more fossil fuels and more CO2 is coming out, and we get more in the atmosphere, the oceans are actually going to take some of that up, and it's going to balance out again, so there'll be more down here. We put more up here, and the oceans are going to take more in and take some of it out of here, right? Okay. If we draw down, let's say we plant lots more forests and we do all kinds of great agriculture, we get rid of the tractors, suddenly we have so much soil carbon down here, and that's no longer a CO2, it's just carbon. It's carbon in carbohydrates, in the proteins, in glomalins, all these different carbon chains. So there's more carbon down here. That's also going to take some of this out of here because it's going from here into the trees and down into the soil. But as it does that, this is like taking the top off of the soda bottle here, and this is going to come back out again. So then we're going to have less in the ocean, great for the ocean, de-acidify the ocean, everybody's happier, the coral's happier, but we still have 400 parts per million up here.
I was going to say, but it's going back into the atmosphere.
The ocean's letting it out, it's going back into the atmosphere.
And why is the ocean letting it out? You're saying just because?
Because literally it's the same thing as a soda bottle, that when we let that, if there's 400 parts per million in the soda bottle, and we open the top, and let's say we only had 200 parts per million in the room, 200 are going to come out and go back into the room, and the water's going to be less fizzy.
So how does it ever actually increase in the atmosphere if it's all balancing out
Because
all
the
the
ocean doesn't
time?
take all of it, it only will take some of it. And as the ocean gets full of how much it can absorb, this will actually go up faster. So that's a little scary.
A little?
So,
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, but I mean, what we're gonna get to tonight is that we don't actually have to worry about any of this.
Oh,
Okay. So, we have natural, easy, affordable ways to deal with with all the parts of climate change that we can implement within a few years, and will take care of probably most of the symptoms of climate change within a few years. And in the long term, we'll take care of this too, because the oceans aren't. There's a point at which it's going to equilibrate. So it's going to be the same amount in the atmosphere and the same amount in the oceans, and everybody's happy, which is where it was for a long time.
For a long time, right? So I think that I'm wondering if what you're saying is that the oceans will heal first.
Exactly, and that's how I like to put it. She gets her due first.
Yeah, so the ocean heals first, and we may not, depending on how carefully we're looking, we may continue to think, oh my God, there's way too much in the atmosphere, because the ocean will just pump
Right.
out what it can no
Right.
longer tolerate once
Right.
it
It will say, hey, we've been doing all these drawdown projects, the soil carbon has grown dramatically. How come there's still 400 parts per million in the atmosphere? That's why, because the oceans will be giving it up. So, however, let's say we did do that. Okay, let's say we did that and it was still 400 parts per million up here, but we had a lot more in all of our soils. Let's say we had cover crops and proper grazing and no-till on all the agricultural soils, and people like my friend Walter is doing projects in the Middle East to undo the desertification there, figuring out how to plant trees, putting seeds into, putting seeds for grasses that will grow in deserts into animal feed in little clay things that will break down only when it rains. And so, it's like great.
Yeah.
All these wicking beds so that whatever food is grown, the water is captured and gets right back into the system. So let's say we do all those projects and we're like, hey, there's still 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. We haven't solved anything. But if the land was all like bread and not like flour anymore, then when a big storm came along, would we have a problem with climate change?
We wouldn't have a problem with runoff.
We wouldn't have a problem with runoff. Would we have the same kinds of flooding?
No.
We wouldn't have the same kinds of flooding. Would we have the desertification and drought we're dealing with climate
Oh,
change?
so we wouldn't, because the soil would be absorbing
Right.
water.
Okay, we're gonna get to that. Yeah, those are good questions.
So ultimately, we're talking about adapting to all this CO2.
Yes, there's even more to the story
Okay.
where that. Do you know what the number one greenhouse gas is?
Methane.
Water.
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 Water is the number one greenhouse gas. It hasn't been calculated into the climate models completely. It was only put in as a secondary feedback loop to carbon because they thought it was too hard to model. But water is the primary greenhouse gas, and the water cycle is what drives the cooling and heating of the planet. So, yeah, so now we're getting into a whole other realm here, which is fine. Okay, so if we have, I've never drawn this before, but let's see what we're going to come up with. Okay, so we have a tree. We have forests all over the continent, and in between, in different places, we have really functional grasslands that have deep, spongy soils, okay? So first of all, let's actually, I have a slide that would be fun to do this with. Let's see. There. Okay, so a lot of you are probably familiar with this slide. Do you want to turn off the light for a second? So on the left we have a landscape that's been restored, and on the right we have one that hasn't been restored. On the left we have deep spongy soils, and on the right we have desertified, hard, crusty soils. If it was 95 degrees out and you were barefoot, which side would you rather stand on?
Definitely on the left.
On the left.
On the green side.
And why is that?
Well, because it's softer.
And cooler.
Softer, yeah. So you intuitively know that something softer is going to be better to stand on when it's hot out. Why?
Well, it won't be as hot.
Why does softer make it not as hot?
Because there's moisture.
Because there's moisture inside, right? We are associating softer with cooler, but the reason softer is cooler is because it's spongy, and so it's got soil moisture in it. So when you have soil moisture going down several feet in there, and not at all, it's all evaporated on the right, then that's going to be cooler, first of all. So that's one way in which having a sponge is going to cool any region that has a sponge in it. If all of Cambridge was all parks, then on a hot day, it would be cooler. Okay, now let's imagine that there's trees on the left side also, but also the grasses are doing this, that all plants have their own system that I've called transpiration, which is basically a plant sweating, and that is letting water out of the plant and into the air in the form of water vapor. When water vapor goes into the air and into the atmosphere, it creates something called a latent heat flux, which pulls the heat away from the surface and releases it further out. So that's why thinking about being in a park is much cooler. There is also shade, right? So that grass is shading the ground. If you had trees, it's creating more shade. But how many people here spend summers in the city without air conditioning? And how many of you also sometimes spent like a week or more in the country during the summer? Okay, why is it that, you know, at 390 Broadway down the road in the summer here, when it was 85, 90 degrees during the day, all night long I'm like flapping my sheets and jumping in and out of the shower and getting cold washcloths and licking my hand, doing everything I can to stay cool at night. And when I go to the Adirondacks, could have just as hot a day, and at night it's cool. So the difference is that in a landscape with lots of plants, a few things are happening. It's a little cooler during the day anyway, but, this is where I should use that little laser pointer. But what's happening here is that in the morning on this side, you would have this mist rising up, right? You wouldn't have that here because it had all evaporated during the day. But here you'd have a mist rising up in the morning, and then sort of in the late morning that would be up, and you'd have sort of little hazy clouds in the sky. By late afternoon, you'd have big thunder clouds over here because the grasses and the trees are hosts to microorganisms that act as precipitation nuclei. They can draw that water vapor to them and form a raindrop that's heavy enough to fall. If you're on this side, you have all this dust that goes up into the air, and the dust particles collect water vapor also, but they can't collect enough to fall out of the air. So you're going to get a smoggy, hazy, humid haze on this side, and you're going to get big puffy clouds on the other side. And so around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, just when you finally got everybody together and decided where you're going to go swimming, on this side, you have a thunder shower. On this side at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's just more hazy and more humid, right? And then at this side, at night, that haze acts like a big blanket. All the sunlight that came down and warmed up the pavement during the day or warmed up the soil during the day can't escape because it has this blanket over it. And you have something called the nighttime re-radiation window that is blocked. Whereas on this side, that big thunderstorm in the afternoon has cleared the sky, and at night you have this beautiful clear sky. You can see the stars, and the heat that came down during the day can go back out to space.
Is that as specific as on this side of the fence, they get a nice afternoon thunderstorm, and these guys are just...
Right. I'm using
yeah,
that
okay.
somewhat
It's a much broader
metaphorically.
thing.
But it is interesting to say, I mean, there
Right
are
at the
people who
fence
have
line.
said,
Oh,
there are people who have big tracts of land like this, who have said it actually rains more on
their
this
land.
side. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that they actually have higher rainfall.
Does it also work in the fact that side, the right side, works sort of as like a brick for like an oven or something, so it absorbs the
Yeah,
heat and lets
yes.
it go quicker, whereas the left side it stays cooler to begin with, but it's maybe absorbing the heat, but then it has an insulating blanket on top, so it's not letting that go.
Yes.
quite as much.
Well, I don't know about the,
Or-
not letting it go, that may or may not, I don't know about
Just-
that one.
yeah.
But I do know that if you think about a stone, right, I mean, a stone is gonna stay warm for longer. So I think it may be more that this is just holding a lot more heat in it. But yeah, that thing about radiating heat is a big piece of what we're talking about. That's a
And
good
is this
point.
guy on the right, like, thinking, geez, maybe I should do that too?
Well, that's the big question. The big question
take a few
is
years.
that, what we've seen is that of the farmers who are doing what's on the left, well, this is grazing land. It's a little, the dynamic's a little different in grazing land. The dynamic here is probably that the guy on the right doesn't wanna, he just wants to turn the sheep out. This is a sheep ranch in South Africa, or Southern Africa. He wants to turn his sheep out and let them wander all over the place. This person wants to go out and move them every day so that they're moving like a herd of animals. And this guy says, I don't wanna do that much work. And that's not the way that my father did it or my grandfather did it. In an agricultural landscape, the issue is that if you put in cover crops, especially mixed species cover crops, and you're not using any of the usual machinery, and you're not buying fertilizer from your best friend who's the fertilizer salesperson anymore, and you're growing things that look like weeds, and you're letting cows graze down instead of using glyphosate to graze down the crops at the end of the year, and you never till, then when you walk into the coffee shop, everyone turns their back on you. And I hear this over and over and over and over again. Right now, I spend a lot of my time traveling and to different agricultural conferences, and people say that the biggest thing holding back regenerative agriculture is peer pressure. And farmers already have the highest suicide rate of any profession. So they're already under tremendous strain. The other thing is that, and part of the reason I think that there's that stress level is that that 50% of the farms in the United States aren't making any profit. They're supported by somebody working off the farm. So half the farms are losing money every year. And the only way to make any money at all is to accept crop insurance. And crop insurance won't, you can't get crop insurance if you're not following best management practices. And you
Which is
can't,
actually worse management.
right, and you can't get a bank loan. So we have some crazy situations, like one of the leaders of regenerative agriculture in a state that I just spoke at, just sold off water rights on his land to, not all the water rights, but limited water rights to a big fracking company, because he could pay off $1.5 million worth of farm debt because he can't get a loan anymore because of the practices that he's doing. So it's the crazy world of people trying to do the right thing and not getting rewarded for it.